Far from a family of visionaries, the McMahon dynasty operated what investigators describe as a sex trafficking ring disguised as a media empire. For decades, they presented themselves as the first family of sports, but behind the curtain, they operated a fortress of non-disclosure agreements designed to hide sex trafficking, steroid abuse, and domestic tyranny. They sold the world a product of scripted violence, but the brutality inside their own walls was terrifyingly real. This is a bloodline where a father allegedly threatened his son with a knife, a daughter was commodified for ratings, and loyalty was enforced through fear and hush money. From the glitz of WrestleMania to the silence of the federal courtroom, this is the forensic profile of the McMahons, a family that conquered the world by selling fake fights while committing real crimes in the dark. The central myth of the McMahon empire is that Vince McMahon is a genius showman, a carnival barker who pulled professional wrestling out of the smoke-filled armories and into the neon glare of the mainstream. But forensic psychology suggests a different, darker classification. Vince McMahon is not merely a promoter, he is a survivor of extreme childhood trauma who constructed a billion-dollar fortress to protect himself from the world. The character of Mr. McMahon, the strutting, power-hungry, abusive billionaire he played on television, was never a fictional creation. It was a confession. It was the armor worn by a boy named Vinnie Lupton, forged in the fires of a violent home in North Carolina, designed to ensure that no one would ever hurt him again. Ultimately, the empire he built stood less as a monument to sport and more as a fortress of control, erected on the ruins of his own father's legacy. The pathology of the McMahon dynasty begins in a trailer park in Pinehurst, North Carolina, in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Before he was the emperor of the WWE, he was Vinnie Lupton, a child living in poverty, estranged from his biological father and trapped in a house of horrors. His mother, Vicky, had remarried a man named Leo Lupton. In the forensic history of the McMahon family, Leo Lupton is the patient zero of the violence. He was a man who communicated with his fists. Vince grew up in an environment where physical safety was a luxury he could not afford. The abuse was systemic and brutal. Leo Lupton went beyond discipline. He terrorized the boy. Vince would later recall incidents where his mother was beaten so severely that he, as a helpless child, could only watch in paralyzed silence. This exposure to raw, unchecked aggression at a developmental age rewired his neurology. It taught him the first and most enduring lesson of his life. Power is the only currency that matters. In the Lupton household, the person with the physical strength made the rules, and the person without it was a victim. This trauma manifested in Vince not as fear, but as a cold, simmering rage. Most children of abuse internalize the violence and become shrinking, timid adults. Vince externalized it. He developed a fight response that was permanently switched on. He began to view the world as a hostile arena where every interaction was a contest of dominance. Decades later, in a rare moment of unguarded honesty, Vince would admit to a reporter, "It is unfortunate that he died before I could kill him." Hardly the statement of a well-adjusted executive, this reveals a man who has fantasized about murder as a form of liberation. The Mr. McMahon persona, the man who would later humiliate employees, bark orders, and relish in the physical destruction of others, was born in those moments of helplessness under Leo Lupton's roof. He resolved to become the monster so that the monster could never get him again. At the age of 12, a tectonic shift occurred in Vince's life. He finally met his biological father, Vincent James McMahon. The contrast between Leo Lupton and Vincent J. McMahon was absolute. Leo was violence and poverty. Vincent J. was elegance and power. Vincent J. McMahon was the promoter of Capital Wrestling Corporation, a successful regional territory that controlled the wrestling business in the Northeast. From Washington, D.C. to New York City, he wore tailored suits, drove Cadillacs, and commanded respect in the smoky backrooms of Madison Square Garden. To the young, battered Vinnie Lupton, this man was not just a father. He was a god. He was the escape route. Vince threw himself into his father's world with the desperation of a drowning man. He changed his name from Lupton back to McMahon, shedding the identity of the victim and adopting the identity of the victor. He wanted to be part of the business. He wanted to be close to the source of this new intoxicating power. But Vincent J. McMahon was a man of the old school. He was a pragmatist who believed that the wrestling business was a dirty, lowbrow racket, suitable for making money but not for raising a son. He wanted Vince to be a lawyer, a judge, a government official, anything but a carnival promoter. He kept Vince at arm's length, sending him to Fishburne Military School to instill discipline and perhaps to keep him away from the ring. But the military school environment only hardened the armor Vince was building. It reinforced the lessons of his childhood: hierarchy, discipline, and the absolute authority of the strong over the weak. Vince thrived in the regimented atmosphere. He became the first cadet in the school's history to be court-martialed, a detail that speaks to his innate defiance of authority, yet he graduated with a sense of invincibility. When he finally wore his father down and was allowed to join the company in the early 1970s, he was assigned to a small, insignificant territory in Bangor, Maine. It was a test. His father expected him to fail, to grow bored of the long drives and the small crowds, and to move on to a respectable career. Instead, Vince conquered Maine. He applied a relentless, aggressive work ethic that baffled the older promoters. He didn't just want to promote wrestling matches, he wanted to engineer spectacles. He saw the potential of television not just as a way to film matches, but as a mechanism for global propaganda. While his father was content running a profitable regional business, maintaining the status quo, Vince was looking at the horizon with the hunger of a predator. This leads us to the moment of the first patricide. In the history of corporate crime, few takeovers are as psychologically loaded as the sale of Capital Wrestling in 1982. It was not a hostile takeover in the legal sense, but it was a moral assassination. The wrestling industry in 1982 was governed by a fragile piece known as the territory system. The United States was divided into regional fiefdoms, overseen by the National Wrestling Alliance. The promoters, Vern Gagne in Minnesota, the Von Erichs in Texas, Jim Crockett in the Carolinas, and Vincent J. McMahon in the Northeast, had a gentleman's agreement. They did not invade each other's turf. They did not steal each other's talent. They did not air their television shows in rival markets. It was a cartel designed to ensure that everyone ate, everyone made money, and order was maintained. Vincent J. McMahon was a pillar of this system. He was a man of his word, respected by his peers for his integrity and his adherence to the code. Vince K. McMahon, however, viewed the code as a weakness. He saw the NWA not as a brotherhood, but as a collection of dinosaurs waiting for the meteor. He approached his father with a proposal to buy the company. Vincent J., nearing retirement and suffering from cancer, agreed. But the sale was predicated on a specific unspoken promise. Vince K. would continue to run the business the right way. He would respect the boundaries. He would maintain the legacy. Vince K. McMahon lied. The moment the ink was dry on the contract, Vince initiated a campaign of scorched earth warfare that would have made Napoleon blush. He structured the deal with his father using a balloon payment system. He had to make quarterly payments based on profits, or the company would revert to the old man. This meant Vince had to expand, and he had to expand immediately. Failure was not an option. Failure meant returning to being Vinnie Lupton. He began to systematically dismantle the world his father had helped build. He broke the gentleman's agreement. He sent videotapes of his WWF programming to television stations in rival territories, California, Georgia, Texas, offering to pay the stations to air his show, displacing the local promoters. This was an act of war. In the insular world of wrestling, it was heresy. He was stealing food from the tables of his father's friends. Then came the talent raids. Vince knew that to win the war, he needed the best ammunition. He targeted the biggest star of the territory system, a blonde, charismatic giant working for Verne Gagne named Hulk Hogan. Vince offered Hogan what the other promoters couldn't: a national platform, merchandise royalties, and a role in a global pop culture phenomenon. He stripped the territories of their top draws: Roddy Piper, Paul Orndorff, the Iron Sheik, Ricky Steamboat. He hollowed out his competitors from the inside. Vincent J. McMahon watched this unfolding chaos with horror. The phone at his Florida retirement home rang off the hook. His old friends, men he had known for decades, called him in tears or in rage, screaming that his son was destroying them. "Vince, what is your boy doing?" they asked. "He's killing us." The father, a man of honor, was humiliated. He tried to intervene, to tell Vince to slow down, to respect the traditions. But the son was no longer listening. The dynamic had inverted. Vince K. McMahon was now the patriarch. There is a specific cruelty to this betrayal. Vince did more than outperform his competitors. He weaponized his father's reputation as a shield to get close enough to stab them. He exploited the trust that Vincent J. had built over 40 years to gain entry into markets and meetings, only to detonate the system once he was inside. It was a patricide of the legacy. He took the Capital Wrestling name and morphed it into the World Wrestling Federation, a distinct rebranding that signaled the end of the regional era and the beginning of the imperial era. The culmination of this aggression was Black Saturday, July 14th, 1984. Vince McMahon ruthlessly acquired the time slot on TBS Superstation that belonged to Georgia Championship Wrestling. Viewers tuned in expecting their local Southern brawlers, and instead found Vince McMahon smiling that shark-like smile, presenting his polished, cartoonish WWF product. It was a hostile occupation of the airwaves. The message was clear: resistance is futile. Vincent J. McMahon died in May 1984, just months before the first WrestleMania would cement his son's victory. He died knowing that his son had become the most hated man in the industry. He died witnessing the destruction of the fraternity he had loved. Forensic psychologists often point to the death of the father as a liberating event for the tyrant. With Vincent J. in the ground, the last restraint on Vince K. was removed. There was no longer anyone to disapprove, no longer anyone to disappoint. The superego was dead, only the id remained. The timing of his father's death and the rise of the WWF is not coincidental. Vince took the grief, the guilt, and the complicated love he felt for his father and shoveled it into the furnace of his ambition. He worked 20-hour days. He micromanaged every detail of the production. He began to inject himself into the product, not just as a commentator, but as the architect of the reality. He was building a world where he was God, where he determined the winners and the losers, a direct counter-reaction to the powerlessness of his childhood. But the seeds of the future darkness were already being sown in these early years of victory. To maintain this breathless expansion, to keep the balloon payments flowing, and to crush the remaining territories, Vince needed his performers to be larger than life. He needed superheroes. And superheroes, he decided, were made in a lab. The acquisition of the company in 1982 coincided with the rampant introduction of anabolic steroids into the locker rooms. Going beyond mere tolerance, Vince industrialized steroid use. He hired Dr. George Zahorian, a urologist who would later be convicted of distributing steroids, to be the ringside doctor. The mandate was clear: get big or get out. The bodies of the wrestlers became the collateral damage of Vince's ambition. He treated them like action figures, pushing them to carry more muscle mass than the human frame was designed to support, demanding they work 300 days a year on hard canvas mats. This was the beginning of the meat grinder. In his quest to prove his father wrong, to prove that the territory system was obsolete, Vince created a working environment that was biologically unsustainable. He was replicating the abuse of his childhood on a macro scale. Just as Leo Lupton had used physical dominance to control his household, Vince McMahon used economic and physical dominance to control his locker room. He owned the names, the likenesses, and the bodies of his independent contractors. By the mid-1980s, Vince McMahon stood atop a mountain of vanquished foes. He had destroyed the NWA. He had humiliated his father's peers. He had consolidated the entire industry under his banner. The abuse victim from the trailer park was now the undisputed king of the ring, but the foundation of this castle was cracked. It was built on a betrayal of the father, on the chemical enhancement of the workforce, and on a deep, unresolved rage that would never be satiated by money alone. The Mr. McMahon character was beginning to leak out from behind the curtain. The world saw a visionary genius. The forensic profile saw a man who had simply traded the violence of the fist for the violence of the contract. The first patricide was complete, but the appetite for destruction had only just been whetted. The ghosts of the ring boys were waiting in the wings. By the late 1980s, the World Wrestling Federation was more than a mere wrestling promotion. It was a cultural hallucination that had intoxicated the American public. Vince McMahon had successfully sold the world on a Technicolor dreamscape, a Saturday morning cartoon come to life where American heroes battled foreign villains, where good always triumphed over evil, and where the bodies of the gladiators were chiseled from granite. Hulkamania was running wild, generating hundreds of millions of dollars in merchandise, ticket sales, and pay-per-view buy rates, effectively burying the gritty, smoke-filled regional territories of the past. To the outside observer, the WWF was the ultimate family-friendly product, safe enough for children and patriotic enough for the Reagan era. However, forensic analysis of this period reveals that the bright primary colors of the product were a calculated distraction. Behind the curtain, the golden era was built on two distinct pillars of exploitation: the systematic sexual predation of young men and the industrial-scale chemical modification of the human body. The locker room was not a sanctuary for athletes. It was a hunting ground for predators and a laboratory for mad science. The first crack in the facade appeared in 1992, exposing a scandal so grotesque that it threatened to dismantle the moral authority of the entire organization. This was the Ring Boy scandal, a dark, festering chapter that has been aggressively scrubbed from the company's official history, but remains a cornerstone in the forensic profile of the McMahon leadership style. It serves as the historical precedent for every cover-up that followed, establishing a pattern of behavior that prioritized the protection of the inner circle over the safety of the vulnerable. The mechanics of this abuse were facilitated by the strict, almost feudal hierarchy of the wrestling world in the 1980s. At the very top were the stars, the gods who lived on Mount Olympus and flew first class. Below them were the agents and executives who wielded administrative power. At the very bottom of the food chain were the ring boys. These were often teenagers or young men, aspiring wrestlers or die-hard fans who were hired for meager pay, sometimes as little as $50 a night, to do the heavy, invisible labor. They assembled the 20-foot steel ring, set up the lighting rigs, and drove the massive production trucks from town to town. They were transient, vulnerable, and desperate to be part of the magic, and their proximity to the stars was their payment. This desperation made them perfect targets for grooming. The man overseeing this crew was Mel Phillips. To the television audience, Phillips was a quirky, harmless figure, a diminutive ring announcer often seen wearing a tuxedo and a bow tie, frantically scurrying away from the giants in the ring. Behind the scenes, however, Phillips was a predator who allegedly operated with a terrifying degree of impunity. Phillips held the keys to the kingdom for these boys. If they wanted to keep their jobs and stay on the road, they had to please Mel. The modus operandi described by the victims was a classic predatory script, one that forensic psychologists see repeated in institutions plagued by systemic abuse. It began with isolation and the testing of boundaries. Phillips would invite the young men to travel with him in his personal car rather than the crew bus, buying them dinners and offering gifts to build a false sense of trust. The grooming process quickly escalated into bizarre requests. Phillips famously had a foot fetish, an obsession that was an open secret within the company. He would offer the boys extra cash to remove his shoes and massage his feet during the long drives between cities. For a teenager with no money and a dream of making it in the business, the line between an eccentric boss and a sexual predator was blurred by the power dynamic. When the boys complied with the foot massages, the demands escalated further, moving from feet to legs and eventually to coerced sexual acts. This was not a case of a single rogue employee operating in the shadows. As the evidence suggests, it was a pervasive culture. Allegations also swirled around Terry Garvin, a former wrestler turned high-ranking talent relations executive, and Pat Patterson, Vince McMahon's right-hand man and the creative genius behind the matches. The ring boys were treated not as employees but as perks of the job for the executives, dehumanized and interchangeable. The scandal exploded into the public consciousness when a brave young man named Tom Cole stepped forward. Cole was the patient zero of the McMahon whistleblower era, a ring boy who claimed he was aggressively pursued, harassed, and abused by Phillips. When Cole finally rejected the advances, the retribution was swift and he was fired, a retaliatory strike designed to silence him. But Cole did not go quietly. In 1992, the story broke in the mainstream media when Cole appeared on The Phil Donahue Show, the biggest talk show of the era, and detailed a toxic environment where sexual compliance was the currency for job security. He spoke of the psychological terror of being a teenager trapped in a car with a powerful executive who refused to take no for an answer, describing a company where human resources existed to protect the predators rather than the victims. The response from the McMahon hierarchy was a masterclass in crisis management and moral bankruptcy, utilizing a playbook they would use again 30 years later. Publicly, Vince McMahon feigned shock and outrage, issuing statements condemning the behavior, while Mel Phillips and Terry Garvin were forced to resign. Pat Patterson also stepped down temporarily, though he vehemently denied the allegations. It appeared, for a brief moment, that the company was cleaning house, but the forensic evidence of the aftermath tells a story of cover-up and complicity. Tom Cole was not treated as a victim to be supported, but as a liability to be neutralized. Vince McMahon personally intervened, and the company reportedly pressured Cole into a settlement involving a sum of money in exchange for silence. The most damning detail, however, lies in the fate of the predators. Mel Phillips, the man at the center of the allegations, was not permanently exiled. In a move that defies all ethical logic, Phillips was quietly rehired by the company shortly after the media heat died down. He was brought back not to be an announcer, but to handle special projects and manage the ring crew again. This decision is the smoking gun of the McMahon philosophy. By rehiring the man accused of molesting the staff, Vince McMahon sent a clear, chilling signal to his entire organization that the safety of children was secondary to the utility of his friends. Sexual predation was not viewed as a disqualifying moral failing. It was viewed as a public relations inconvenience to be managed. This established the precedent for the cover-up culture that would fester for another 30 years, making the Ring Boy scandal the prototype for the NDA-fueled silence that would characterize the later decades. While the sexual predation was destroying the souls of the support staff, a different kind of rot was destroying the bodies of the performers. The 1980s and early 90s were the era of the body guy. Vince McMahon had a specific aesthetic vision for his superstars, desiring giants and comic book characters made of flesh. He wanted veins that looked like garden hoses, shoulders that looked like cannonballs, and muscles that defied human physiology. He was selling a superhero fantasy, and he needed his actors to look the part. But the human body has genetic limits. No amount of training or diet can turn a 220-pound man into a 300-pound monster with 5% body fat. To achieve the WWF look, the roster had to turn to chemistry, turning the locker room into a pharmacy and the wrestlers' bodies into laboratories. The dealer-in-chief was Dr. George Zahorian, a Pennsylvania urologist who became the Candy Man for the wrestlers. Zahorian was a fixture at the arenas in the Northeast, distributing anabolic steroids, painkillers, and sleeping pills with the efficiency of a fast food franchise. The mechanics of the operation were brazen, with packages from Zahorian arriving at arenas via Federal Express, addressed to the wrestlers, but often collected by management. In the locker room, doctors would set up shop, handing out vials of decadurabolin and testosterone cypionate alongside bottles of Halcyon and Percocet. The culture was so pervasive that steroid use wasn't just tolerated. It was practically a job requirement. Forensic testimony from wrestlers of that era describes a terrifying pressure cooker where showing up small meant being relegated to opening matches or fired, while showing up enhanced guaranteed a push to the main event. Vince McMahon, himself a voracious bodybuilder, set the standard. He was the ultimate alpha male, training at 2 a.m. and carrying a physique that was suspiciously muscular for a corporate executive in his 40s. He was not just the boss, he was the gym partner, normalizing the chemical enhancement. The visual evidence of this era is irrefutable, seen in the bodies of the Ultimate Warrior, the British Bulldog, the Warlord, or Hulk Hogan. These were men carrying massive amounts of lean muscle with the telltale signs of heavy androgen abuse, chemical sculptures, built to satisfy Vince McMahon's visual fetish for mass. The cost was internal and devastating. The steroids ravaged their organs, thickening heart walls and raising blood pressure to stroke levels, while painkillers created a cycle of addiction. The stars of the golden era were rotting from the inside out, dying to entertain. In 1991, the federal government finally took notice. The Dr. Zahorian trial exposed the pipeline, and the trail of evidence led straight to the top: Vince McMahon. In 1993, the United States Department of Justice indicted Vince McMahon on charges of conspiracy to distribute anabolic steroids and defrauding the FDA. This was the trial of the century for the wrestling world, United States versus McMahon. The stakes were existential. A conviction meant up to 8 years in federal prison and the certain death of the WWF. The government's theory was simple and compelling, arguing that Vince McMahon was the head of the cartel who created the demand, facilitated the supply, and profited from the results. The trial took place in the summer of 1994 and became a surreal piece of legal theater. The prosecution called a parade of wrestlers to the stand, but the star witness was Hulk Hogan. Hogan was the face of the company, the man who had told millions of children to train, say your prayers, and eat your vitamins. Under oath, Hogan was forced to admit that the vitamins were actually syringes of illegal hormones. However, in a twist that forensic historians and legal scholars debate to this day, Hogan's testimony was not the kill shot the prosecution expected. While he admitted to using steroids and receiving them with Vince's knowledge, he testified that Vince had never explicitly ordered him to take them. He claimed he took them for his own personal reasons, to help heal injuries and maintain his physique. This distinction between ordering and enabling was the lifeline Vince's lawyer, the brilliant and ruthless Jerry McDevitt, seized upon. McDevitt dismantled the government's case by painting Vince not as a drug lord, but as a naive businessman who simply let independent contractors do what they wanted with their own bodies. It was a defense built on plausible deniability, the favorite shield of the corporate criminal, arguing that he didn't tell them to break the law. He just created an environment where breaking the law was the only way to succeed. The jury, perhaps confused by the nuances of the law or charmed by Vince's charisma, bought it. On July 22, 1994, Vince McMahon was acquitted on all counts. The verdict was a shock to the legal observers who had seen the mountains of evidence regarding the steroid culture, but the acquittal was a watershed moment in Vince McMahon's psychological profile. It was the moment the cement hardened. A normal man, having stared into the abyss of federal prison, might have emerged humbled and cautious. Vince McMahon did the opposite. He emerged emboldened, interpreting the not guilty verdict as divine validation. He had fought the United States government and won, facing the full power of the law and walking away unscathed. This moment crystallized the invincible God complex that would define the next 3 decades of his rule. He began to believe that he was untouchable, that he could talk his way out of anything, buy his way out of any scandal, and outsmart any adversary. Post-trial, the mask came off completely. Vince stopped pretending to be the smiling, clean-cut announcer on television and began to transition into the character of Mr. McMahon, the evil, tyrannical owner. The most terrifying realization for forensic observers is that Mr. McMahon was the most honest thing he ever produced. The character who degraded women, mocked the disabled, destroyed his enemies, and ruled by fear on screen was simply the unleashed ID of the man who had survived the steroid trial. The Ring Boy scandal and the steroid trial were the foundational sins of the empire, establishing the dark rules of engagement for the McMahon dynasty. Victims were disposable liabilities whose silence was purchasable, laws were suggestions to be navigated rather than respected, and the bodies of the employees belonged to the company to be consumed and discarded. By the mid-1990s, the golden era was dead, and as the new millennium approached, Vince McMahon would turn his appetite for destruction inward, targeting the only thing he had left to conquer, his own family. By the turn of the new millennium, Vince McMahon had achieved what Alexander the Great could not. He had conquered his known world and lived to tell the tale. He had destroyed the territorial system that his father held sacred. He had vanquished his billion-dollar rival WCW in the brutal corporate warfare of the Monday Night Wars. And he had established a global monopoly on the industry of professional wrestling. He was the undisputed Caesar of sports entertainment, sitting atop a mountain of cash and vanquished foes. But forensic psychology teaches us that for the malignant narcissist, external conquest is never enough. The quiet that follows victory is terrifying because it forces the conqueror to be alone with himself. To silence that internal void, the tyrant must find new subjects to dominate, new boundaries to violate, and new wills to break. For Vince McMahon, the ultimate test of power was not ruling an army of employees or crushing a competitor. It was ruling his own bloodline. The narrative of the McMahon family in the 2000s defies the typical story of corporate succession. Instead, it is a story of cannibalism. It is a modern-day Greek tragedy played out on cable television and in closed boardrooms, where a father, terrified of his own mortality and irrelevance, systematically devours the identities of his children to feed his own ego. The character of Mr. McMahon, the strutting, power-hungry, abusive billionaire he played on television, was not a fictional creation. It was a diluted documentary of the man who sat at the head of the dinner table, a patriarch who viewed his wife and children not as human beings to be loved, but as intellectual property to be exploited, assets to be depreciated, and psychological extensions of himself to be controlled. The dynamic between Vince and his firstborn son, Shane McMahon, serves as the primary case study for this destruction. In any traditional business dynasty, from the Fords to the Murdochs, the eldest son is the heir apparent, groomed with care to take the throne and carry the legacy forward. But Vince McMahon suffered from a deep-seated psychological condition often referred to by historians and psychoanalysts as the Laius complex, named after the mythical Greek king who, fearing a prophecy that his son Oedipus would kill him, attempted to destroy the child. Vince harbored a primal subconscious fear that his son would one day surpass him, overthrow him, and replace him. To Vince, Shane was not a legacy. He was a clock ticking down the seconds of Vince's own relevance. Instead of mentoring Shane, Vince competed with him. He treated Shane not as a prince, but as a rival who needed to be constantly reminded of his inferiority. This tension came to a terrifying, violent head in a private boardroom meeting in the early 2000s, an incident that has become legendary among wrestling insiders for its sheer psychotic intensity. The context was the changing landscape of combat sports. Shane McMahon, possessing a foresight and business acumen that his father largely lacked, had identified a struggling, near-bankrupt company called the Ultimate Fighting Championship. At the time, the UFC was considered human cockfighting, banned from pay-per-view in many states and bleeding money. But Shane saw the future. He understood that the audience's taste was shifting toward realism, toward the raw authenticity of mixed martial arts. He approached his father with a proposal: buy the UFC. The price tag was negligible for a company of WWE's size, a mere few $1,000,000. Shane envisioned a future where the McMahons controlled the entire spectrum of combat, from the scripted theater of WrestleMania to the bloody cages of the Octagon. It was a brilliant strategic pivot that would have eventually made the family billions of dollars. Vince McMahon killed the deal. He did not kill it because the numbers didn't make sense. The financial risk was minimal. He killed it because it was Shane's idea. He killed it because if the UFC succeeded under Shane's guidance, Shane would have something that belonged only to him: a victory that Vince could not claim. According to multiple sources within the industry, including former WWE creative writer Court Bauer, who recounted the story years later, the rejection was not merely verbal. In a moment of terrifying escalation that reveals the depth of Vince's volatility, the meeting descended into a primal confrontation. Vince, enraged by Shane's persistence, or perhaps threatened by his son's competence, allegedly pulled a knife. This was not a penknife or a letter opener. It was described as a substantial blade. The gesture was theatrical, yes. Vince is a showman even in private, but it was deeply, violently menacing. He reportedly offered the weapon to his son with a chilling ultimatum that echoes the darkest Shakespearean dramas. If Shane wanted to take control, if he wanted to make the decisions, he would have to cut his father down right there. He had to kill the king to become the king. This was not a negotiation tactic. It was a psychological assault. It was Vince telling his son that power in the McMahon family was not inherited, not earned through merit, and not given through love. Power was taken through blood. It was a raw display of dominance designed to traumatize and submit. Shane retreated. The deal was abandoned. The UFC was eventually bought by the Fertitta brothers for $2 million, and they turned it into a $4 billion empire, money that should have belonged to the McMahons. The financial loss was staggering, a historic blunder, but the psychological damage was permanent. Shane McMahon realized in that boardroom that he would never be allowed to succeed on his own terms within his father's kingdom. He was trapped in a double bind. If he failed, he was weak and unworthy. If he succeeded, he was a threat to be neutralized. This realization eventually drove Shane to self-exile in 2009, leaving the company and the country to escape the suffocating shadow of a father who would rather see the business fail than see his son get the credit for saving it. If Shane was the rival to be crushed, Stephanie McMahon was the possession to be used. The forensic profile of Vince's relationship with his daughter is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire saga, crossing the boundaries of decency into the realm of emotional incest and sexual exploitation. To Vince, Stephanie was not just a daughter. She was a female character in his play, and in Vince's world, female characters existed for one primary purpose: to be sexualized, humiliated, and controlled. The most grotesque evidence of this pathology lies in the creative pitches Vince made regarding Stephanie's real-life pregnancies. These are not rumors. They are confirmed by Stephanie herself in video interviews, recounted with a nervous laughter that belies the horror of the memory. When Stephanie became pregnant with her first child in 2006, Vince saw an opportunity for great television. He pitched a storyline where he, her biological father, would be revealed on national television as the father of her unborn child. He wanted to enact an incest storyline, casting himself as the patriarch who had impregnated his own daughter. When Stephanie, understandably horrified and disgusted, refused this pitch, Vince did not back down or apologize. He simply pivoted to Plan B. If he couldn't be the on-screen father, then perhaps Shane, her brother, could be. He suggested a storyline where the siblings had engaged in an incestuous relationship. From a forensic and psychological perspective, this is not simple shock TV or pushing the envelope. It is a window into a deeply disordered mind that does not recognize the incest taboo or the autonomy of his children. It suggests a desire for total godlike ownership. By suggesting he impregnate his daughter, Vince was subconsciously asserting that he was the alpha and the omega of her existence. He created her, and he could create through her. He wanted to collapse the family tree into a single point: himself. He wanted to be the father, the grandfather, and the creator, erasing any outside genetic influence. Although these specific storylines never made it to air due to Stephanie's absolute refusal, the fact that they were proposed in a corporate setting in front of writers and executives reveals the depth of the rot. It shows a man who had lost the ability to distinguish between his twisted fantasies and reality. What did make it to air, however, was a systematic campaign of humiliation and violence. For years, Vince booked Stephanie in segments where she was verbally abused, called filthy, slut, whore, and bottom feeder by male wrestlers, often under his direction. But the physical violence was even more jarring. In the 2003 pay-per-view event No Mercy, Vince booked himself in an I Quit match against his own daughter. More than a wrestling match, what unfolded was a ritualistic beating. The imagery of that night was nightmarish. A father, significantly larger, stronger, and steroid-enhanced, brutally beat his daughter in the center of the ring. He choked her with a lead pipe. He threatened to strike her with a steel chair. He grabbed her by the throat and slammed her to the mat. The crowd cheered, desensitized by years of violent programming, but forensic observers saw a domestic abuse fantasy played out as sport. Vince was publicly disciplining the unruly female, reasserting his physical dominance over the child he had created. Stephanie's role was to beg, to scream, to bleed, and ultimately to submit. This was how Vince bonded with his children, through trauma. He was teaching her that love and pain were indistinguishable and that her body belonged to the business. It was a conditioning process that hardened Stephanie, stripping away her softness and molding her into the queendom executive, a ruthless corporate shark who mirrored her father's lack of empathy because empathy had been beaten out of her. Presiding over this house of horrors was Linda McMahon, the matriarch. For decades, the public narrative, carefully crafted by WWE PR, painted Linda as the dignified one, the quiet, suffering wife who stood by her eccentric husband with grace. She was the yin to his yang, the rational business mind behind the creative chaos. But forensic analysis of the family dynamics suggests that Linda, rather than being a passive victim, served as a calculated enabler. She was the Lady Macbeth of the saga, a woman who traded her dignity, her protective maternal instincts, and her moral compass for wealth, power, and political access. The most symbolic representation of Linda's role occurred during the Attitude Era in a storyline that eerily, almost cruelly, mirrored her real-life emotional paralysis. On television, Linda was portrayed as comatose, a sedated, catatonic woman confined to a wheelchair, staring blankly ahead while the world burned around her. While she sat frozen and helpless, Vince openly flaunted his affairs with younger women, specifically the wrestling diva Trish Stratus, right in front of her face. In one infamous segment that aired to millions of households, Vince drugged his wife to ensure she was unconscious and then engaged in heavy petting and kissing with his mistress directly over Linda's unmoving body. While this was scripted entertainment, the psychological subtext was screamingly loud. It was a metaphor for the reality of their marriage. Vince had been publicly unfaithful for years, with rumors of affairs, sexual coercion of employees, and ring boy scandals swirling around him. Linda had learned to turn a blind eye, to enter a state of emotional catatonia to survive the humiliation. She chose the lifestyle over the truth. She chose the mansions in Greenwich, the private jets, and the status over the protection of her marriage vows. But her complicity went deeper than just enduring affairs. Linda McMahon was the CEO of the company during the height of the Ring Boy scandal. She was the one who signed the checks. She was the one who oversaw the human resources department that rehired predators like Mel Phillips. She was the one who navigated the steroid trials alongside Vince. She knew where the bodies were buried because she helped dig the holes. Her silence was transactional. Linda McMahon used the fortune built on this dysfunction, a fortune built on steroid abuse, sexual exploitation, and the destruction of her family's privacy, to launch her own political career. In the late 2000s and early 2000s, Linda spent over $100 million of this blood money on 2 failed United States Senate runs in Connecticut. She attempted to sanitize her image, presenting herself as a grandmotherly stateswoman, scrubbing the stench of the locker room from her resume. She distanced herself from the vulgar product whenever the political spotlight turned on, claiming she was just the business manager. But she could never fully wash her hands. Every dollar she spent on TV ads was generated by the broken bodies of dying wrestlers and the silence of abused employees. She was the gatekeeper of the fortress, the one who ensured that the non-disclosure agreement machinery kept running so that the money kept flowing. She sacrificed the emotional well-being of her children and the safety of the employees on the altar of her own ambition. The tragedy of the McMahon family in this era is that they achieved everything they wanted, but lost everything that mattered. By the 2000s, they were incredibly wealthy, politically connected, and globally famous. But they were a hollow shell. Shane was in exile, living a separate life in New York, forever seeking the approval of a father who held a knife to his dreams. Stephanie had been molded into a mini Vince, a corporate weapon who had learned that survival meant shedding her humanity. And Linda was a political figure, haunting the halls of Washington, trying to outrun her past. They sat at holiday dinners, exchanged expensive gifts, and posed for smiling photos. But the emotional reality was a wasteland. Vince McMahon had succeeded in turning his family into a wholly owned subsidiary of WWE. He had consumed them. He had monetized their pain, scripted their humiliation, and erased their boundaries. The Laius complex was complete. He had proven that he was the only one who mattered, the sun around which the broken planets of his wife and children revolved. But as history shows, a family built on fear, trauma bonding, and transactional loyalty has no true structural integrity. When the external pressure finally cracked the walls, in the form of federal investigations and trafficking lawsuits years later, Vince would find that he had no true defenders left. He had driven away the son who would have fought for him. He had alienated the daughter who would have protected him, and he had turned his wife into a political statue. He was the king of the ashes, ruling over a graveyard of relationships he had personally destroyed. The cannibal had eaten everything, and soon he would starve. By the mid-2000s, the World Wrestling Entertainment machine was operating with the efficiency of a global conglomerate, a publicly traded entity that had sanitized its image for Wall Street. The blood and vulgarity of the Attitude Era had been dialed back, replaced by a polished, high-definition product marketed to a new generation. Vince McMahon sat in the boardroom of Titan Towers not just as a promoter, but as the chairman of a media empire that rivaled the major sports leagues in reach and influence. However, forensic analysis of this period reveals that beneath the corporate gloss, the company was functioning as a biological meat grinder. The toll of the ruthless aggression era was not measured in Nielsen ratings, but in the premature mortality of its workforce. The wrestlers were dying at a rate that defied statistical probability, their hearts exploding from decades of chemical abuse and their brains rotting from repeated trauma. This era would be defined by 2 specific horrors: the forensic nightmare of the Chris Benoit murder-suicide and the bureaucratic cruelty of the Ashley Massaro cover-up. These events exposed the two primary mechanisms of the McMahon regime: the destruction of the body and the silencing of the soul. The darker reality of the wrestling business exploded into the national consciousness on a sweltering weekend in June 2007 in a quiet suburban home in Fayetteville, Georgia. This was the home of Chris Benoit, a wrestler revered by fans and peers alike as the greatest technical performer of his generation. Benoit was the embodiment of the McMahon work ethic, intense, stoic, and physically relentless. He was a man who had sacrificed his body to the business, taking thousands of falls, concussions, and unprotected chair shots to the head to entertain the audience. On June 25, 2007, police entered his home and discovered a crime scene of unimaginable horror. Benoit had brutally murdered his wife Nancy and their 7-year-old son Daniel before hanging himself in his home gym. The immediate reaction from the WWE machine was a reflexive attempt to control the narrative. Vince McMahon, appearing on national television in an empty arena, paid tribute to the fallen hero, framing the event as a tragic, inexplicable loss. But as the details of the murders emerged, the calculated nature of the killings over a 3-day weekend, the placing of Bibles next to the bodies, the narrative shifted. The media began to ask questions about roid rage, pointing to the toxicology reports that showed elevated levels of testosterone in Benoit's system. For Vince McMahon, this was a manageable crisis. He could spin steroid abuse as the personal failing of a flawed individual, distancing the company from the crime. However, the true horror of the Benoit case was not chemical, it was structural. It was found not in his blood, but in his brain tissue. The Sports Legacy Institute, led by Dr. Julian Bales, conducted a forensic analysis of Chris Benoit's brain. What they found shattered the personal responsibility defense that Vince McMahon had relied on for decades. The autopsy revealed that Benoit's brain was riddled with chronic traumatic encephalopathy, a degenerative disease caused by repeated head trauma. The forensic description of Benoit's brain was chilling. Although he was only 40 years old, his brain resembled that of an 85-year-old Alzheimer's patient. The tissue was covered in brown tangles of tau protein, literally rotting away inside his skull. The regions of the brain responsible for impulse control, emotional regulation, and memory were destroyed. This was not a monster born of evil. This was a brain that had been pulverized into madness by the very job he was paid to do. The diving headbutts, the chair shots, the nightly collisions, these were not just stunts, they were cumulative brain damage. The implications for the McMahon empire were existential. If the industry standard, the very style of wrestling that Vince McMahon profited from, caused workers to lose their minds and kill their families, then the entire business model was a public health hazard. Vince's response to this forensic revelation was a masterclass in corporate erasure. He did not accept responsibility. He did not overhaul the in-ring style to eliminate head trauma immediately. Instead, he made Chris Benoit an unperson. He banned the mention of his name. He edited him out of the video archives. He scrubbed the history books. Vince McMahon decided that if he erased the man, he could erase the cause of death. It was a brutal act of revisionist history designed to protect the stock price from the reality of the damage the product caused. The Benoit tragedy proved that in the McMahon ecosystem, the performers were disposable components. When they broke, they were discarded. And if they broke in a way that embarrassed the brand, they were deleted. While the Benoit case exposed the physical horror of the industry, the case of Ashley Massaro exposed the moral vacuum at the executive level. Ashley Massaro was the winner of the Diva Search, a beautiful, spirited young woman who was thrust into the wrestling world with little training. She was a marketing dream, the cover girl for Playboy, and a loyal employee who did whatever was asked of her. In 2006, the company asked her to participate in the Tribute to the Troops tour, a goodwill mission to visit American soldiers stationed in the Middle East. It was a PR coup for Vince McMahon, positioning his company as a patriotic pillar of American culture. During the tour in Kuwait, a catastrophic event occurred. According to a sworn affidavit Massaro would later submit, she was sexually assaulted and raped by a U.S. military doctor at a base clinic. She was drugged, paralyzed, and violated while ostensibly under the protection of the company she worked for. The trauma of the event was compounded by what happened when she returned to the United States. Massaro, terrified and broken, did what any employee would do. She reported the incident to her superiors. The meeting that followed is one of the darkest moments in the history of corporate negligence. Massaro met with Vince McMahon and his right-hand man, Kevin Dunn, the executive producer of WWE television. Massaro expected support, legal aid, or at least human empathy. Instead, she received a cold, calculated lesson in corporate priorities. According to her testimony, Vince McMahon and Kevin Dunn did not express outrage at the crime. They expressed concern for the brand. They allegedly told her that the WWE had a crucial, lucrative partnership with the U.S. military. They told her that revealing the rape would ruin the relationship between the wrestling company and the armed forces. They told her that for the good of the company, she needed to be a good soldier and bury the trauma. The phrase, "take one for the team," was implied in every silence. Vince McMahon, the man who played a tough guy on TV, looked a rape victim in the eye and told her that the company's stock price and PR image were more important than her justice. They did not just ask for her silence, they orchestrated it. The legal machinery of the company kicked into gear, not to prosecute the rapist, but to ensure Massaro never spoke publicly. This was the silencing machine at work. It was a system designed to prioritize the institution over the individual at every turn. Ashley Massaro, like Tom Cole before her, learned that she was not a person to Vince McMahon. She was a liability. The psychological toll of this suppression was lethal. Ashley Massaro carried the secret of her assault for over a decade, the trauma festering in the darkness of the non-disclosure agreement culture. She suffered from depression, addiction, and the crushing weight of injustice. In 2019, Ashley Massaro took her own life. She was 39 years old. In her suicide note and the legal documents she left behind, she pointed a finger directly at the McMahon empire. Her death was not just a suicide. It was the delayed result of a corporate policy that treated human dignity as a tradable commodity. Vince McMahon had sacrificed her soul to protect his quarterly earnings. The mechanism that enabled both the erasure of Benoit and the silencing of Massaro was the weaponization of the legal system, specifically the non-disclosure agreement. Under the guidance of his longtime attorney Jerry McDevitt, Vince McMahon constructed a legal fortress that made the truth prohibitively expensive. The NDA was not just a contract, it was a psychological cage. It stripped victims of their voice, their history, and their ability to heal. Forensic analysis of the company's financial records, which would later be exposed in the 2022 internal investigation, revealed the existence of a black fund. This was a system of off-the-books payments, often mislabeled in the corporate ledger, designed to pay hush money to women and former employees. Over the course of 16 years, Vince McMahon paid nearly $20 million to suppress allegations of sexual misconduct, infidelity, and harassment. This money was not charity, it was a bribe. It was the cost of doing business for a predator. The brilliance of the silencing machine was how it isolated the victims. A woman who signed an NDA was legally barred from speaking to the press, to the police, or even to other victims. She was trapped in a silo of silence, believing she was alone. This prevented the formation of a collective voice, a Me Too moment, for decades. Vince McMahon understood that if the victims ever found each other, his empire would crumble. So he bought them off, one by one, using the immense wealth generated by the wrestlers' broken bodies to ensure his own survival. The juxtaposition of the Benoit and Massaro cases paints a complete forensic picture of the McMahon leadership style in the 2000s and 2010s. On one hand, you had the physical exploitation. Wrestlers were encouraged to work through concussions, to take dangerous risks, and to abuse their bodies until their brains rotted, resulting in murder-suicide. On the other hand, you had the moral exploitation. Victims of sexual violence were coerced into silence to protect corporate partnerships. The graveyard of champions was filling up. Eddie Guerrero died of heart failure at 38. Umaga died of a heart attack at 36. Test died of an overdose at 33. China died of an overdose at 46. Ashley Massaro died by suicide at 39. These were not accidents. They were the statistical inevitabilities of a system that operated without a safety net, a system where the wellness policy introduced after Benoit's death was often a PR smokescreen that could be bypassed by the top stars. Vince McMahon presided over this necropolis with a terrifying detachment. He continued to produce the show. He continued to strut to the ring. He continued to sign checks to make problems go away. He believed that the graveyard was just the cost of doing business, and that the silence of the dead was his greatest asset. But forensic history teaches us that trauma cannot be buried forever. The bodies of the wrestlers told a story that the PR department couldn't spin. The brain tissue of Chris Benoit remained under the microscope, an eternal accuser. The affidavit of Ashley Massaro remained in the legal archives, a ticking time bomb. The silencing machine was powerful, but it was not perfect. It required constant maintenance, constant cash, and constant fear. And as Vince McMahon aged, as his judgment faltered and his appetite for depravity grew, the machine began to creak. The NDAs were piling up. The secrets were becoming too numerous to contain. The era of the graveyard was ending, and the era of the reckoning was about to begin. The ghosts of the golden era and the ruthless aggression era were gathering at the gates, and they were about to be joined by a new victim, a woman named Janelle Grant, who would finally break the lock and let the world see the monster inside. By 2019, the corruption at the heart of the McMahon empire had metastasized. The sexual misconduct of the 1980s, characterized by the Ring Boy scandal, and the cover-ups of the 2000s exemplified by the Ashley Massaro tragedy, were horrific, but arguably contained within the framework of workplace harassment and corporate negligence. However, as Vince McMahon entered his mid-70s, his behavior devolved into something far more criminal and legally perilous. The boundaries of his invincible God complex expanded to the point where he no longer viewed the women in his orbit as employees or even as mistresses, but as chattel, living, breathing currency to be traded, shared, and debased to solidify his business deals and satisfy his darkest psychological urges. This era, hidden behind the blacked-out windows of Titan Towers and the encrypted silence of text messages, marks the transition of the WWE from a toxic workplace into an alleged criminal enterprise operating a sex trafficking ring. The victim at the center of this maelstrom was Janelle Grant, and her forensic profile reveals the ultimate depth of Vince McMahon's depravity. The recruitment of Janelle Grant followed a classic predatory script, targeting a subject not for her strength, but for her profound vulnerability. In 2019, Grant was a woman standing on the precipice of total collapse. She was grieving the recent death of her parents, she was unemployed, and she was facing financial ruin. She was the perfect target for a man who viewed human relationships through the lens of power dynamics. When she met Vince McMahon, he did not present himself as the barking tyrant of television. He presented himself as a savior. He offered her a lifeline, a job at WWE headquarters in the legal department, and a promise to take care of her. But forensic psychology tells us that for the narcissist, there is no such thing as a gift. There is only a loan with interest. The job was the bait, and the cost would be her body, her dignity, and her soul. The relationship quickly pivoted from professional mentorship to coerced sexual servitude. Vince McMahon made it clear that her employment was inextricably linked to her sexual compliance. But unlike the affairs of the past, which were kept in the shadows, Vince began to document this exploitation with a reckless compulsion. He sent Grant hundreds of text messages that would later become the smoking gun of his undoing. Devoid of romance, these messages read like the commands of a master to a slave. In one particularly chilling exchange, Vince explicitly stated his intent to dismantle her humanity, texting that he wanted to break her down until she was so low she would beg him to sell her to other men. This is the language of a trafficker. It reveals that his pleasure was derived not just from the sexual act, but from the degradation of the partner, from reducing a human being to an object that could be owned and discarded. The environment inside WWE headquarters, specifically within the executive suites, transformed into a dungeon of abuse. Grant described a routine of terror where she was summoned to Vince's office for sexual encounters during work hours, while his assistants sat outside the door, guarding the perimeter. The walls of Titan Towers, adorned with posters of smiling superheroes, hid a reality of gothic horror. Vince introduced sex toys into these encounters, naming them after his wrestlers, blurring the lines between his on-screen fiction and his off-screen perversion. But the abuse was not limited to standard sexual acts. It escalated into the realm of extreme depravity, culminating in a humiliation ritual that defies comprehension. In May 2020, during a sexual encounter involving another person, Vince McMahon allegedly defecated on Janelle Grant's head. This act of scatology is critical to the forensic profile of the offender. It signals a complete detachment from social norms and a desire to inflict the ultimate biological insult on the victim. It was a way of marking her, of saying that she was beneath him in every conceivable way. Following this incident, Vince allegedly instructed her to continue pleasuring him, forcing her to suppress her biological revulsion through sheer terror. This moment broke the psychological barrier. Grant realized she was dealing with a man who had no floor, no limit to what he would do to satisfy his need for dominance. However, the definition of trafficking requires more than just abuse. It requires the commercial exchange of a person. Vince McMahon crossed this legal Rubicon by involving his inner circle in the exploitation. He did not keep Grant to himself. He shared her, treating her as a party favor for his loyal lieutenants. The primary accomplice in this network was John Laurinaitis, the head of talent relations. The irony of Laurinaitis' title is grotesque. His job was to manage the human resources of the company, but in reality, he allegedly functioned as Vince's pimp. Vince gifted Grant to Laurinaitis, instructing her to have sex with him as a reward for his loyalty. The encounters took place in hotels and at the headquarters, often under duress. Laurinaitis, a towering former wrestler known as Johnny Ace, participated in the abuse with a callous efficiency, reinforcing the message that Grant was property of the corporate suite. But the most damning evidence of sex trafficking, the detail that elevates this case to a federal crime involving commercial interests, involves the former UFC heavyweight champion and WWE superstar, Brock Lesnar. In the lawsuit, Lesnar is referred to as a former UFC fighter, but his identity was quickly corroborated by industry insiders. The timeline is crucial. In 2020 and 2021, Vince McMahon was locked in tense contract negotiations with Lesnar. The star knew his worth and was demanding an exorbitant sum to return to the ring. Vince, desperate to secure his biggest attraction, used Janelle Grant as a bargaining chip. He directed Grant to produce sexually explicit photos and videos of herself, which he then sent to Lesnar. This was the sweetener in the deal. But it went further. Vince allegedly promised Lesnar a play date with Grant. The text messages reveal a transaction where a human woman's body was offered as part of a compensation package alongside royalty rates and downside guarantees. Lesnar reportedly responded with enthusiasm, requesting videos of Grant urinating, which she was coerced into providing. A physical meeting was arranged. Grant was told she would be passed around between Vince and the Beast. The only reason the physical assault by Lesnar did not occur was an act of God. A blizzard grounded Lesnar's plane on the day of the scheduled encounter. However, under federal law, the intent to traffic and the use of a victim to secure a commercial contract constitutes the crime. Vince McMahon had effectively turned his employee into a prostitute to save money on a wrestling contract. The physical toll on Janelle Grant was devastating. The aggressive, violent nature of the sexual acts left her with injuries consistent with torture. She suffered from bleeding, bruising, and severe mobility issues. In her lawsuit, she detailed how the rough sex resulted in nerve damage to her back and legs, leaving her unable to walk without excruciating pain. To keep her functional, Vince allegedly instructed her to use a massage chair and take painkillers, treating her like a damaged piece of equipment that needed maintenance to remain in service. The cruelty was absolute. When she expressed pain, she was ignored or mocked. When she tried to set boundaries, she was reminded of her precarious financial situation. By 2022, Vince McMahon decided that Grant was no longer useful. She was broken, physically and emotionally, and she had become a liability. He initiated the discard phase of the narcissistic cycle. He pressured her to sign a non-disclosure agreement in exchange for $3 million. This was the silencing machine at work again, the same mechanism that had buried Ashley Massaro. Grant, desperate to escape the orbit of her abuser and needing money for medical treatment, signed the document. She was moved out of the company to a no-show job, erased from the building, just as Chris Benoit had been erased from the archives. However, Vince McMahon's arrogance became his downfall. He made a fatal error. He stopped paying. After the initial installment of $1 million, the payments ceased. Perhaps he felt he was untouchable. Perhaps he believed Grant was too terrified to speak even without the money. But by defaulting on the payments, he voided the contract. He invalidated the very NDA that protected him. Furthermore, the nature of the crimes, sex trafficking and RICO violations, rendered the NDA unenforceable under federal law. You cannot contractually agree to cover up a felony. The forensic profile of this period reveals a man who had completely lost touch with reality. Vince McMahon believed he was operating in a sovereign state where the laws of the United States did not apply. He believed that the tactics of the 1980s, intimidation and hush money, would work in the 2020s. He failed to realize that the world had changed. The Me Too movement had shifted the cultural landscape. The federal government was cracking down on human trafficking, and the victims were no longer suffering in silence. When Janelle Grant filed her 67-page lawsuit in January 2024, it was not just a legal complaint, it was an autopsy of the McMahon soul. The document laid bare the text messages, the dates, the locations, and the names. It exposed the threesomes in the office while employees worked down the hall. It exposed the complicity of the board members who looked the other way. It exposed the reality that the WWE, a company listed on the New York Stock Exchange, had been used as a front for the sexual gratification of its chairman. The details of the Grant case induced a wave of nausea across the wrestling world and the business community. The sponsors, Slim Jim, Mars, TKO, recoiled in horror. This was not wrestling drama. This was a crime against humanity. The image of Vince McMahon defecating on a woman's head became the defining metaphor for his legacy. A powerful man who shat on the people below him because he believed they existed only to absorb his filth. As the Department of Justice opened a criminal investigation into these allegations, issuing subpoenas and seizing phones, the walls of the fortress finally began to crumble. The Predators network was exposed. John Laurinaitis was fired and turned on his former boss, claiming he was a victim of Vince's control as well. Brock Lesnar was quietly pulled from creative plans and erased from the video games. And Vince McMahon stood alone in the ruins of his reputation. The trafficking of Janelle Grant was the final straw. It was the moment the Reynolds curse of moral decay reached its terminal velocity. The biology of the family had been corrupted, the bodies of the wrestlers had been destroyed, and now the legal immunity of the patriarch had been shattered. There were no more moves left on the chessboard. The genius was revealed to be a monster, and the empire was revealed to be a cage. The only thing left was the fall. By the winter of 2022, Vince McMahon appeared to be a man who had successfully outrun his own shadow. Following the initial leaks of the hush money scandal, he had briefly stepped down, retiring to his penthouse in a performance of contrition that forensic observers immediately recognized as a strategic pause rather than a genuine exit. To the outside world, it seemed the system had finally worked. The board of directors had investigated, the money had been identified, and the patriarch had been put out to pasture. But Vince McMahon operated on a timeline that disregarded public sentiment. In his mind, he was not a retired CEO. He was a monarch in temporary exile, plotting a restoration. What followed in early 2023 was one of the most ruthless corporate counter-coups in American business history, a maneuver that proved his tactical brilliance remained intact even as his moral compass had completely disintegrated. However, this final act of dominance would ultimately prove to be his fatal error, the trapdoor that he opened beneath his own feet. In January 2023, Vince McMahon used his controlling Class B stock, shares that gave him super voting power, to force his way back onto the board of directors. It was a hostile takeover of his own company. He fired the independent directors who had investigated him, reinstating himself as the executive chairman. His daughter, Stephanie, who had been serving as co-CEO and bringing a modernized, sanitized face to the brand, immediately resigned. Forensic analysis of this moment suggests it was the final fracture of the family unit. Stephanie saw the writing on the wall. She knew that her father's return was a kamikaze mission. She chose to eject before the crash. Vince was now alone at the helm, surrounded only by yes men and the ghosts of his past. His objective was clear: to sell the company. Vince McMahon realized that the only way to secure his position and bury the scandals was to merge his kingdom with a larger entity, one powerful enough to shield him from the growing storm. He initiated a sale process that culminated in April 2023 with a deal that shook the sports world. WWE was sold to Endeavor, the parent company of the UFC, run by the ruthlessly efficient super agent Ari Emanuel. The two companies, WWE and UFC, would merge to form a new publicly traded combat sports giant called TKO Group Holdings. On paper, this looked like Vince's ultimate victory. He had turned the regional promotion he bought from his father for $1 million into a $9 billion global juggernaut. He was named executive chairman of TKO. He stood on the balcony of the New York Stock Exchange, ringing the opening bell, his hair dyed a defiant jet black, his face sculpted by surgery, looking down at the world he had conquered. He believed he had found a new protector in Ari Emanuel, a fellow shark who understood the rough nature of the fight business. He believed that by selling the company, he had laundered his reputation, burying the hush money and the sexual assault allegations under a mountain of new capital. But forensic history reveals that this was a catastrophic miscalculation born of arrogance. In his desperation to stay in power, Vince McMahon had committed the cardinal sin of the tyrant. He gave away the keys to the castle. By selling WWE to Endeavor, Vince lost the one thing that had protected him for 40 years, his controlling vote. In the old WWE, he was the emperor. He could not be fired because he owned the majority of the voting power. In the new TKO, he was merely an employee, a high-ranking one, yes, but an employee nonetheless, answerable to a board he did not control, and a CEO, Ari Emanuel, who was beholden to shareholders, not loyalty. Vince McMahon had unwittingly signed his own death warrant. He had walked into a trap where his invincible God complex was no match for the cold, hard math of Wall Street liability. The trap sprung on January 25, 2024. This was the day Janelle Grant filed her 67-page lawsuit in the United States District Court for the District of Connecticut. As detailed in the previous forensic profile, the lawsuit was not a vague collection of rumors. It was a granular, horrifying dossier of sex trafficking, physical torture, and corporate complicity. It contained text messages, dates, and descriptions of depravity that made the Ring Boy scandal look quaint by comparison. But the crucial difference between 1992 and 2024 was the environment. In 1992, Vince owned the company and could weather the storm. In 2024, he was an executive at TKO, a company that also owned the UFC and had blue-chip sponsors like Visa, DraftKings, and Disney to answer to. The reaction was immediate and nuclear. The Slim Jim brand, a sponsor synonymous with wrestling since the days of Randy Savage, immediately paused its advertising campaign. This was the financial signal the new owners needed. Ari Emanuel and Mark Shapiro, the leaders of TKO, did not view Vince McMahon as a genius or a father figure. They viewed him as a cancerous asset. He was radioactive. In the corporate calculus, keeping Vince McMahon meant losing hundreds of millions of dollars in sponsorship and stock value. The decision was made in minutes, not months. The phone call that ended the McMahon dynasty did not involve a negotiation. It was an execution. According to reports, Vince was told that his position was untenable. There would be no fight, no media spin, no Mr. McMahon strutting down the ramp to challenge God. He was told to resign, effective immediately. On January 26, 2024, less than 24 hours after the lawsuit was filed, Vince McMahon submitted his resignation. He was stripped of his titles, removed from the board, and effectively evicted from the building he had built. There was no retirement party. There was no tribute video. There was just the sudden, sterile silence of a key card being deactivated. The emperor had not just been overthrown, he had been erased. But the fall of Vince McMahon was not just a corporate firing. It was the beginning of a damnatio memoriae, the ancient Roman practice of condemning the memory of a fallen tyrant. The new regime moved with terrifying speed to scrub his existence from the product. His profile was removed from the website. He was edited out of the WWE 2K24 video game showcase mode. His name, once mandated to be spoken with reverence on every broadcast, became a forbidden word. The commentators were instructed to ignore his legacy. The documentaries were shelved. TKO Group Holdings understood that to survive, they had to perform a surgical excision of the tumor. They had to prove to the world that WWE was no longer the McMahon family business. While the corporate erasure was humiliating, the true existential threat came from the United States government. The forensic narrative of the McMahon Empire ends not in a boardroom, but in the offices of the Southern District of New York. The Department of Justice had been quietly investigating Vince McMahon since the summer of 2023. Federal agents had executed a search warrant, serving Vince with a subpoena and seizing his phone. This was the escalation that turned a civil lawsuit into a criminal nightmare. The federal investigation is focused on sex trafficking and the potential violation of the Mann Act. The text messages revealed in the Grant lawsuit, specifically those offering her to other men and coordinating sexual encounters across state lines, provided a roadmap for prosecutors. Furthermore, the use of company funds to pay the NDAs raised the specter of securities fraud and embezzlement. Vince McMahon, at the age of 78, is facing the very real possibility of dying in a federal prison. The legal fortress built by his lawyer, Jerry McDevitt, over 40 years, had finally been breached. The NDAs were worthless. The boys in the back were turning state's witness. The omerta of the wrestling business had been broken by the sheer weight of the evidence. The final autopsy of the McMahon dynasty reveals a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions. This is a family that conquered the world but lost its soul. Let us look at the forensic ledger. Vince's father, Vincent J., died watching his son destroy the honorable traditions of the business. Vince's brother Rod lived and died in obscurity, estranged from the madness. Vince's son Shane was exiled, threatened with a knife, and humiliated until he walked away. Vince's daughter Stephanie was groomed to be the queen, only to be forced to resign to save her own reputation from her father's stench. Vince's wife, Linda, became a political figure who effectively lived a separate life, her marriage reduced to a business arrangement protected by silence. And Vince himself ends his days in isolation, a pariah in the industry he created, surrounded by lawyers, waiting for the indictment. The McMahon Empire is dead. The company, WWE, survives, but it is now just a corporate asset in the portfolio of a massive media conglomerate. It is run by corporate executives like Nick Khan and Triple H, men who are professional managers, not blood patriarchs. The erratic, violent, creative chaos of the McMahon era has been replaced by spreadsheets and quarterly earnings calls. The story of Vince McMahon is the story of American capitalism taken to its absolute sociopathic extreme. It is the story of a man who believed that if you made enough money, you could rewrite the laws of morality. He believed he could treat people like action figures, breaking them, trading them, and discarding them. He believed he could commodify everything, the sweat of the wrestlers, the bodies of the women, and the love of his children. For 50 years, he was right. He won every war. He beat the government in 1994. He beat WCW in 2001. He beat the sterile boredom of regular sports. But the universe has a way of balancing the books. The karma that Vince mocked for decades finally arrived not in the form of a rival promoter, but in the form of a woman named Janelle Grant, armed with nothing but the truth and a stack of text messages. The fall of Vince McMahon proves that there is no such thing as an invincible God. There are only men, and eventually the darkness they cultivate inside themselves grows large enough to swallow them whole. The arena is empty, the lights are off, and the tyrant is finally, truly alone.